I think the major challenge we face is making sure that schooling is worth turning up for staff and for pupils. So making schools worth turning up for adults, making them great places to work, and making sure that the same applies to young people and families, that they're places that young people want to go to. You want them to think, this has really got something to offer me, and I'm excited about the possibilities of at least some part of it, and I feel like I'm included, I feel like my voice is heard, and it's going to help me do something great with my life. And I don't think we've got that. I mean, I think all of us want that. And I think even the people I disagree with want that. We just need to find common ground.
Welcome to Rethinking Education. Education's critical friend.
Friends, Earthians, hominids, welcome once again to the Rethinking Education podcast, education's critical friend. In the last episode, I was joined by almost 300 people as we had our first ever live podcast, when I was also joined by Naomi Fisher, Ellie Costello, and Ben Davis to talk about the attendance crisis. In case any of you listened to that episode and were thinking, hey, who's this Ben Davis guy? Why don't you do a whole episode with him? Well, you're in luck, because that's exactly what's happening right now. This is literally it. Strap yourselves in. Ben Davis is the head teacher of St Ambrose, Barlow, RC High School in Salford in Greater Manchester. Before this, he was a head teacher in Scotland, and before that, a drama teacher. I've had the great pleasure to get to know Ben a little over the last year or so, because he's part of the Education Policy Alliance, a new grassroots think tank dedicated to crowdsourcing education policy. Exciting news on which soon. We have just written our first policy paper. It's about to come out. Keep your eyes and ears peeled. If you want to keep abreast of what's going on that front, sign up to the newsletter. In the show notes, there's a link, and you will be the first to know. Ben is one of the loveliest people that you could wish to meet, a view that was echoed in many of the comments that we received during last week's episode. A principled, passionate head teacher who embodies the principles of public service. Ben has recently been one of the courageous heads who have raised their heads above the parapet to talk about the pernicious impact that Ofsted can have on schools and school leaders. And it looks very much like we're going to be hosting the next National Rethinking Education Conference at Ben's school in Salford. This is not an official announcement, but it looks very much like that's going to happen. And I'm very excited about that. More on which soon also. But for now, I'm going to get out of my own way and hand over to my recent fascinating conversation with Ben Davis. I hope you enjoy the show. And so does Mr. Pickles, who you can maybe hear or see in the background there. We're going to go and get a Thai green curry. Until the next time.
Let's rethink education.
So we've been chatting on and off for quite a few months, haven't we, about a wide range of things as part of this interesting new group, the Education Policy Alliance. Mm-hmm. Don't necessarily want to talk about that right now, but just for the benefit of listeners, we've sort of got to know each other a little bit over the last few weeks and months. Mm-hmm. And that's really an effort to try to essentially to crowdsource ideas for education policy, isn't it? And we've had quite wide-ranging discussions around things like attendance and behaviour and recruitment and retention and Ofsted. Yep. Which I think we're going to talk about.
Talked about that a lot, yes.
Yeah, as has half the country. Yeah. For the last 6 months or so, which I'm sure that people are very well familiar with. But I would like to start with Ofsted, if I may, because it's so current, and because you have some really interesting views on it. And so just for the benefit of listeners, would you mind to just introduce yourself to get the ball rolling, and to say, what role you do now and how long you've been there, and like a brief summary of your teaching career to date.
Sure. Okay, I'll give that a go. Thank you, James. Right. So I'm currently head teacher of St Ambrose, Barlow Roman Catholic High School, which is a largish secondary school in Salford. In terms of its demographic, it serves the whole of the city of Salford, which I'm sure most people will recognise as being part of Greater Manchester and adjacent to Manchester City itself. And in terms of our intake and levels of deprivation, we're broadly speaking in line with the national averages. And I've been in the school for 8 years as head. Before that, I was head teacher of a secondary school in the west of Scotland. So I've moved education systems and moved schools, and I'm going to say I've got the scars to show it, but it has been very much an experience of humble learning, I think is probably the best way to put it. And in that time that I've been at St Ambrose Barlow, I think I've now become, in the local authority, the most inspected head of a mainstream secondary school. So since 2019, I think there have been 24 inspections across the 15 secondary schools in Salford, and 3 of them have been at St Ambrose Barlow. And full disclosure, folks, we are currently requires improvement for the 3rd time.
Right.
But
okay.
We're not really, right?
Yeah, officially you're in that category. And so just can I just recap that? You said that did you say that there's 19 schools?
I think there's 15 mainstream secondary schools. I think 23 secondary schools of one sort or another, all told.
Oh, right. Okay. And with of those schools, though, there's been more than one inspection per school.
On average, yeah. There's a tiny number of schools that since 2019 haven't had a visit, but the vast majority of us have had the call.
Right. Yeah. Okay. And you're the most inspected. So how many times have they been in the 6? Do you say you've been there for 6 years?
I've been there for 8 years, and I think it's 7 times, 6 or 7 times, and we've had a diocesan inspection. And during the pandemic, we've had 3 inspections.
Right.
They really enjoy. It must be the quality of the catering or something. They really enjoy coming back.
Yeah, you must have really good cakes or something.
Yeah.
That's something else. So, and is that because you've been in this requires improvement category, or were you in a different category before that? Why are they coming? Because average is like 4 or 5 years, isn't it? So why are they coming so often?
Well, it is related to us being requires improvement. Although the arcane mysteries of Ofsted inspection timings are just that, a mystery. And prior to me starting at the school, it had a headline judgment of outstanding. But it's fair to say there was quite a bit of turbulence and change, and a change to that judgment was inevitable. So I think that's part of the reason. Equally, I can think of outstanding schools, of other schools that have not had anything like the frequency of inspection, and they are inadequate or requires improvement. So, and that's something that I would want to delve into a little bit more, actually.
Yeah. So is it the case that your school, because previously when schools were rated outstanding, Ofsted sometimes wouldn't visit them for like 10 or 15 years or more, right? And so, but they've now been told that they need to inspect all of those schools. And so is yours one of those schools that they came back around?
No, ours they came back to in 2016, having not been there since 2008, because I think a number of factors. There was a change of leadership. I arrived. We opened a 6th form. There was the school merged with another school. So I think it's inevitable and probably quite right that there's some kind of oversight of the school externally after all that kind of change. And 8 years is a long time for a school to go through that kind of change and not have some, if you believe scrutiny is necessary, not have some kind of scrutiny.
Yeah, okay. And so obviously this is a live situation, and are you expecting them to come back again soon?
So we last welcomed them in March 22. So in theory, if they stick to their timings, then they should return sometime between March 24 and September 24. And it is possible there might be a monitoring visit in that time. And do you know, that monitoring visit could be next week, for all I know. But I'm not sure that they've read their handbook on their own timings, because they seem to be pretty flexible on these things.
Yeah. Okay. And how has that been for you? Like, is it like the normal frequency, as we said, is like the average is supposed to be 4 or 5 years.
Yeah.
Like, so you're saying that it's every 2 years for a school in the RI
Roughly, yeah.
bracket. Okay.
Yeah, 2 to 3.
But 6 inspections in 8 years is a lot. And so how has that been for you to be working under that level of scrutiny over such a long period of time?
It makes school improvement much more difficult, because it means that it is very difficult, particularly I'd say 2 or 3 years ago when I was, or no, longer than that, 5 years ago, when I was still relatively new to the school, because you feel like you're constantly second guessing the timing of the next inspection. There is a real risk that you're doing things for Ofsted, no matter how much you might not want to, and how much you might think that that's not the right thing. It's a very tough balance between preparing for that inspection and just undertaking steady school improvement, because school improvement is always, when it's sustainable, is always lengthy, it's complex, it isn't linear, it's entirely driven by people. So it relies an awful lot on people's feelings and on people's personal reactions to changing circumstances. All of those things don't sit well with the sword of Damocles inspection hanging over you. And it undoubtedly has a subsequent impact on people's well-being, because it just becomes a gnawing weight for that phone call to come in. I could tell you the precise details of the timings of every phone call I've ever received, where I was when I was told, what the phone call was like, what time it was. And I've got other senior leaders who I've worked with for a long time who half jokingly say they've got PTSD from that process, but really it's not funny, because it does have that impact on you.
Yeah, that sort of idea has come up a few times in this series of conversations that I've been having on Ofsted. And likewise, I've not been a head teacher, but I have been a teacher where Ofsted have been in my lessons. And likewise, I could tell you exactly when and where those observations happened. And I think it's because of the sort of the heightened, like people often say, what's it called? Like a flashpoint memory or something. People used to say, previous generations, I guess, like everyone could remember where they were when they heard that JFK had died. Later, it was like when Diana died or something. It was one of those sort of the flashbulb moments, flashbulb memories, aren't they, in the psychological literature, because it's sort of so out of the ordinary and carries such an emotional charge. And I think that's like certainly my experience is when an inspector enters your room, it's sort of like almost surreal how intense it is, and how this dreadful sort of flood of adrenaline, like that thing when you have to slam the brakes on in the car if you think something's going to step out in front of the road, and your body just floods with adrenaline. And at that point, you can't really think clearly, because you're like, whoa. And I remember sort of having an internal monologue once and just thinking, there's an actual inspector in my actual room right now. Like, it's just like, oh my goodness, it's actually happening after so long. And we've been talking about it so much. It is really like hyper real in some sense. It's quite unusual. I
think you've nailed it. That's a very good description. And of course, schools, and I have to think honestly, particularly senior leaders and the head teacher, live with that day after day, month after month after month. And I've seen it really, really bring people down, really drag people down into in some cases into a sense of despair. In some cases, it freezes people. In other cases, it prompts really poor decision making because you're second guessing. In other cases, it's just this constant lingering fear that strips the job of enjoyment, that takes away the power of the personal connections that you could build with young people and staff and families. And there's this sense of paranoia that everyone is looking at you. Now, you've obviously gone into that role as a senior leader, knowing that it will carry with it a degree of public exposure. Any leadership role does. But I can absolutely relate to some of the heads who I've talked to who say that after the inspection, where there wasn't a favourable outcome, they walked through the local shopping centre thinking that every single eye was on them. There's that person who has destroyed our school. When in fact, that's not the case, because very, very quickly you come to conflate the judgment on the school with a judgment on yourself as a professional and ultimately as a person.
Yeah.
And that's very, very damaging.
And local newspapers, I don't know what your experience has been, but local newspapers often like take those Ofsted judgments at face value, and they're like, yeah, local head teacher, there'll be the headshot of you stood outside the school and it's like school placed in RI or whatever it might be. There is that sort of that sense of essentially like naming and shaming of hardworking professional people who are trying to do the best by their students. And it's you know, this thing about the language that you're just talking there about, the lingering fear. You know, I came across this phrase a while ago. I'm sure I've mentioned this on previous episodes of the podcast. It was a quote that somebody had put on Peter Gray's book, and it said that the education system is like a wish in a fairy tale that's gone horribly wrong. You know, like a really one of those things that anybody would wish for, and it's just become sort of cursed in some sense. And that might sound like strong language, but when you think about it, like the infrastructure that we have in place that's already paid for, we have these buildings that are, you know, geographically like accessible, and kids can go there while their parents go to work, and they can make friends with other people of their age and learn about the world and gain qualifications and be taught stuff by these knowledgeable, caring adults. Like on paper, there's just nothing not to like about that. Like it sounds brilliant. Like if
That's fantastic, doesn't it? Yeah.
If that didn't exist, you'd invent it tomorrow. Yeah. And yet, when you zoom in, we see that there's this weird sort of like self-defeating trait in humans. It seems where we're sort of somehow within this paradise, and you could expand this wider than just the school system. We're sort of all making one another miserable. And it doesn't have to be that way. Like you were saying, like it stops you from improving the school. It stops you from being able to build relationships of trust and you know, just, you know, it stops people from flourishing and thriving. And Ofsted isn't the only reason that is happening, but it does seem to be a significant one that everybody has really woken up to, or not really woken up to. I think there's something about the fact that people like yourself are speaking out now in a way that hasn't happened before. There's been a fear of that, hasn't there? There's been a fear of people speaking out because you think, well, that's just going to anger the big beast. It's going to make them come down even harder next time.
That's absolutely right. And when I did speak out a few months ago, I was told there's a target on your back now. But I think now I've been a head teacher for nearly 12 years. And I feel like I've got a duty, along with some other people, to speak out and say, this should be different, this can be different, and look what it is doing. There is this desire, as espoused in Ofsted's own vision statement, to raise standards and improve lives. No one is quibbling with that. And like Sir Ken Robinson used to say, who on earth would argue against raising standards? It's a dead metaphor, isn't it?
Right.
But the fear that it has created in the system, and the irony of the fact that it's created issues within schools that are then labelled by Ofsted as gaming or off-rolling, and they are unethical, there's no question of that, but they are a response to the system that Ofsted has created, that Ofsted then inspects and criticises schools for. There's something so gargantuanly circular about that and so damaging that it's really hard to put it into words. And faced with all of that and the fear that runs through the system, like it runs like an absolute electric current through it. You can feel it. Schools crackle with it sometimes. It creates distorting management practices. So you hear of groups of schools that have adopted Ofsted style practices, and they do mocksteds and all those sorts of things on the basis that the aim should be to be ready for Ofsted. And that would just suggest to me that we've lost the plot. The aim is to do something much more noble and much bigger and much more expansive than be ready for Ofsted. And faced with all that, I think leaders have really got very few choices. You either summon some kind of courage from somewhere and say, look, I'm absolutely terrified of this. It carries with it huge personal risk, and I feel a gigantic responsibility to the staff I work with, to the people who've said they want to walk this journey with me, to the pupils and their families. But if I don't find that courage and go with this and just do what I think is right within the constraints of the resources that I've got, then the alternative is just to fold and to become some kind of flunky of the system. And that's not appealing. But I can see that it creates huge mental health problems for lots of people. It's done so for me. It has at times made me ill. I've gone into counselling because of it. I've talked very openly about that. And the first time I talked about it, a little bit like you describing the inspector coming into your room, I couldn't believe the words were coming out of my mouth. But that's absolutely right. I remember a counsellor saying to me when we went into the first lockdown, I had my last session just before that lockdown started. And she said to me, "You look totally different." She said, because the tanks are off your lawn, aren't they? You don't need to worry about this now. And she was absolutely right. And for several months, that was the case. And I've been very, very fortunate to work with a brilliant team over several years to lead and improve our school. It's an absolute privilege to do it. It's just frustrating that sometimes the nuances of that process aren't captured in what is a fairly bloodless report. But one of the issues for me in all of this is that when I step back from it, I think, we shouldn't even be talking about Ofsted. Ofsted are just the regulator, so to speak, and instead we talk about them like they are the purpose of our system. And in fact, the conversation shouldn't be about Ofsted at all. And ironically, I think Ofsted would say the same thing, but the reality is something else altogether. So I think we need to question why it is that we're even talking about this system in that way.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? They often say things like that, don't they? They're like, "Oh, don't worry, don't write any extra plans. We just want to come and see you as you are." And it seems like they seem to lack a certain amount of self-awareness as to just how much fear they strike into the hearts of people like yourself and people throughout the community, kids as well, support staff, classroom teachers, other leaders. If only it were true. And I think that if, for example, if they didn't publish the reports, right, if the report remained private between you and either your local authority, if you're a local authority school, or your trust leaders or whatever, if it wasn't published, then I think that would go a long way. And they say that they need to publish them because they provide information to parents, but as we talked about in the report that we wrote for the Education Policy Alliance, the quality of that information is highly questionable. And there was a study that was done recently that suggested that half of the time, if a parent looks at the latest Ofsted report, it'll be out of date. It's out of date information because there's
that's right.
Quite likely to have been a change of leadership and a change of direction at the school since that report was written. So the quality of information that is highly questionable. The very idea that you can rank something as complex as a school on a 4-point scale and suggest that actually means something real is ridiculous. We've moved away from grading lessons because we realized that was methodologically ridiculous, but we haven't let go of grading schools yet. And so the quality of information that they're giving is poor quality and out of date. And so that's a very weak defense, isn't it?
Well, yeah. And also the reports are in the region of about, I think, 600, 700 words to describe anything from a monitoring visit to a 2-day visit. And a 2-day visit in a large school could involve 7 or 8 or more inspectors. And the language they use it's a real achievement, actually. It manages to be over-specific, blunt, and esoteric all at the same time. So Ofsted's own data says that 65% of parents find the new version of reports that have existed since 2019 easier to read. I would question that, and I'm not convinced that many parents use an Ofsted report solely to make a judgment about a school. But I've got a few. We can play bingo here. I've got a few examples, right? So these are just from random reports. You can't identify the school from them, but I've got quotes here where they describe in the first section, which is what the school does well, pupils are equipped well to tackle gender stereotypes and they understand how mortgages work, all in the same sentence. Right? And then you've got incredibly technical language that applies to one subject that many people of all walks of life would struggle to understand, or at least have to go and look up in the dictionary. In English in year 10, by fully understanding the term hamartia, pupils could analyse what led to Romeo's downfall in the play Romeo and Juliet. So two examples there that demonstrate that kind of language. And then if you were to take, and I do this sometimes with the team as a way of making the point that we're not doing this for Ofsted. I've got in front of me something I did recently with the team, where I've got 5 quotes from good reports and 5 quotes from RI reports, and I defy you to spot which is good and which is RI.
Yeah.
Do you want to have a go, James?
Yes, please do.
Right.
Let's have a little game.
Okay. And this first sentence is an absolute beaut. It demonstrates just how circular and literal Ofsted like to be. Leaders are taking appropriate actions to improve attendance. This is important as some pupils do not attend school regularly enough. Which is helpful that they gave that clarity there in the second sentence. Do you think that's a good or an RI report?
I'm going to go with RI because it sounds like they're damning them with faint praise.
It's a good report.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Shows what I know.
Right. Here's another one. Some pupils have not achieved as well as they should, as some still have gaps in their knowledge. Pupils with special educational needs and disabilities do not always receive precise enough support. RI or good?
Oh, I'm going to go RI again.
It's a good, and it's a good. It's good all the way.
Right. Interesting.
Yeah. Pupils' behaviour at social times is typically calm. However, during lessons, some staff do not follow the behaviour policy well enough to address the disruptive behaviour of a minority of pupils. This hampers pupils' learning in certain subjects.
I'm going to go good.
It is good.
I'm getting the hang of it.
Yeah. So you see, then if I read you a couple from RI, this is a welcoming school. Leaders are passionate about providing pupils with the best experiences. Relationships between pupils and staff are positive. Pupils enjoy coming to school. Most pupils enjoy their learning and experiences, so they attend school regularly. That's an RI school.
Yeah.
That sounds like a nice school. I'd like to send my kids there.
I'd send my kids there.
So
Have you got one more?
Do you want one more? Right. I'll give you another RI. Most pupils enjoy coming to school. They said that they feel safe. Pupils work hard to support their local community. They have opportunities to raise funds and support local charities. This helps them to empathise with others who are less fortunate than themselves.
That sounds like it requires further improvement. That's not good enough. That sounds amazing. It's so absurd, isn't it?
That's an RI. That's actually that's the school I work at. So,
really? Right. There you go. Oh my goodness. Yeah. Right. So, I mean, yeah, and I've worked in outstanding schools. I've worked in schools that are in special measures, and I've seen amazing things happen in schools that are in special measures, and I've seen very, very concerning things happening in outstanding schools, and vice versa, right? Like there's so much more. If you had to do a Venn diagram of not of what Ofsted having their categories, but if you had a Venn diagram of what those schools were actually like, I don't think it would even be a straight line. They would just be all over the place. But there would be so much more of an overlap. Yeah. We're talking about like tiny little differences at the margins often between schools, and making a very, very harsh distinction between something that you could fit a Rizzler paper between. Yeah.
And highly subjective judgments from inspectors who are, whether they will admit it or not, who are undoubtedly prey to unconscious bias based on what they've read, because they do a fair bit of homework before they come into the school. And it means that you can easily be in a position where you're on the back foot, you're basically on the back foot facing Shane Warne at the Oval. And that's not a good position to be in for anybody. And I think that is something that we probably don't talk about enough. I have spoken to school leaders who say that and this hasn't happened to me, that the inspector arrived at 8 o'clock on the first morning and gave the impression that they had already judged the situation. But certainly I've had most inspectors come into the school on the first day and say, so how would you grade yourselves? To which my response is, well, that's your job, not mine. And you need to work this out with me. But I've had examples of inspectors asking staff to spell the word dyslexia. I've had children and staff in tears. I have submitted complaints in the past to Ofsted. I can think of a number of situations that made people, staff in particular, deeply uncomfortable about the inspection process. Equally, I can think of a number of inspectors that we welcome into the school who are clearly highly competent, very skilled human beings who are seeking to do the best and probably struggling to fit it within the constraints of the framework that they have to work in.
Yeah. One of the things that's I've been thinking about a lot. One of the last people that I interviewed in this series was a head called Calvin Henry. I don't know if you know him.
I read it.
Yeah. He was in the press a bit because he had a very similar experience to Ruth Perry, where he had this sort of Kafkaesque experience where the inspectors came in to what he strongly felt was a good school, and he was an Ofsted inspector himself with lots of experience of grading schools. And he was saying that, like, under a previous framework, it was based on APS, on average point score, right? And it was very clear. It was like numerical. You could just use a spreadsheet to decide what category a school was going to go in. And you could argue the merits of that. But he said that when the new thing came in and everyone was applauding it and saying, "Oh, it's great, they're moving away from looking at data and they're going to look at the curriculum and they're going to look at the processes and stuff," it suddenly became super subjective, and it was just down to the individual lead inspector and their team to sort of interpret how this thing is going to be, how this is going to be understood. And it just opened up lots of areas of ambiguity. Is that your understanding as well? Is that something that you recognize?
Yeah, it absolutely is. I mean, I do a lot of trawling. It's a bit of a running joke of the Ofsted website because it does fascinate me, and I like to try and understand the process. And for me, it's the system that's at fault. It's the framework that's the problem. It's the very existence of Ofsted. I'm not pointing the finger at individuals who undertake inspection, although I absolutely applaud those who have protested by handing in their badges. But people make decisions on personal basis for personal reasons. So I'm not going to criticize anyone. Nevertheless, I can absolutely identify with what you've just described, highly subjective actions and comments to very, very specific instances of things happening in schools. And Ofsted really are the masters of taking something that's a single instance and doesn't represent anything other than what's happened at that moment or what's been said at that moment, and then expanding that to a hypothesis or a line of inquiry that can be very damning and can also be extremely difficult to defend without making it look like what you're doing is being an apologist for poor practice. So, for example, a stray comment by a pupil. I think we've all read discussions of children allegedly demonstrating sexually inappropriate behavior, but what they were doing in the playground is doing the floss. Those kinds of things. Young people displaying, let's say, tactile behavior towards boys displaying tactile behavior towards one another in the canteen, let's say, when they're queuing up, and that being reframed as child-on-child abuse or concerns around safeguarding. And things are rarely as straightforward as that. They're often much more nuanced. And equally, 1,000 or so young people in a school every day with 150 adults is, if you zoom back from it, is a community that a good friend of mine always used to say, that should never work, but it does. And it works far more often than it doesn't. But within that, you've got to accept the huge variability in the way that everyone reacts to that environment. And I don't think Ofsted truly captures that. And to go back to the point you made about achievement data, I've come across a number of fairly recent inspection reports where you've got both good and outstanding judgments applied to schools that have got significantly negative Progress 8 scores. And I think on one level, it's absolutely fair that the impact of the pandemic is being taken into account in that respect, if that's what's happening, and data is being discounted. On the other hand, there are lots of schools that haven't yet reached the good or outstanding judgments, who've slaved away, improved outcomes hugely, and aren't yet reaping the benefits, if that's what we want to call it, of a more positive Ofsted grade.
Yeah, fascinating. So just to wrap up this bit on Ofsted, like to go back to this report. So we've just written this consultation paper with the Education Policy Alliance, and essentially we came up with a bunch of recommendations that we wanted people to comment on. And this is not a policy paper; it's just some ideas that we're kicking around at the moment. But essentially, the main thing for me is that Ofsted's remit is so broad. Like they're writing reports, they're doing these subject reviews, they write reports on knife crime, like they're talking, like what you're saying, they're talking about, do kids understand mortgages? Like it's a really, really broad remit. And by their own measure, like the way that they say, like, safeguarding is so important that it's a rate limiting thing. So you could be good for everything else, but if we find that there's a fault with safeguarding, that's enough of a reason to haul you over the coals and to put you into a lower category. And then they don't turn up for another 5 or sometimes even longer years. But even if it's once every 4 or 5 years, as they say that it should be, that's not enough, right? That's not frequently enough to be able to make sure that school is safe. Like it's not enough. And so it seems like what needs to happen is that their remit, either Ofsted needs to be massively expanded as an organization, which I think very few people would argue for, so that they can do this thing every year, or it needs to be massively slimmed down so that their focus, if safeguarding is so important that that's essentially their primary function, then take it seriously and do a safeguarding visit every year. And lots of that stuff can be done remotely, right, by looking at things like like turnover and absenteeism. You can see lots of things. There are indicators in the data, but essentially, so our first recommendation would be to slim down Ofsted's remit to focus primarily on safeguarding. What do you think about that as an idea?
Yeah, well, I think slimming Ofsted's remit's got a lot of merit. I mean, Ofsted's got 1,800 employees according to their own website. It's a very large organisation. And interestingly, I think, although it talks about its inspections of settings other than schools, it's CAFCAS, for example, the first thing that comes up when you go onto their website is the option to find an inspection report about a school. The second one encourages you as a parent to comment on your child's school. So let's make no bones about it. Ofsted's focus is very much on schools. And that's because although it is independent, it is in effect, and has become so, in my view, more recently, an ideological arm of government. It enacts policy. It's also become the curriculum body, de facto curriculum body, other than the DfE, for England. And consequently, it wields a great deal of power, and it is inspecting some of the very concepts that it is pushing out. Its research papers are given huge amounts of time on in service courses as part of training for senior leaders. And yet there's been a lot of critique of those research papers from all sorts of quarters, including from people who are named in them, who have suggested that they would rather not be named in them. And that is crowding out a huge range of other research that would be a benefit to schools. So slimming its remit would make sense. I think a focus on safeguarding should be a key part of that. I think there's further discussion to be had around that, James, particularly in relation to the role of local authorities. We undergo a safeguarding audit every year from our local authority that is far more rigorous and far more searching than any Ofsted conversation I've had around safeguarding. And I think this also, for me, goes to the heart of all this. We don't do safeguarding in our school because of Ofsted or because of the local authority. We do it because it's entirely the right thing to do to keep children safe. And it's not like we need Ofsted to exist to feel a sense of accountability. Leaders, unless they're deeply unethical people, feel that sense of accountability, and it's what drives them. And I feel a strong sense of accountability to our governors, to our families, to pupils, to the local community. That's why when we have an unfavourable outcome or the results aren't as good as they want, that feels difficult to absorb. It feels shameful. And I think part of the discussion also needs to be, what exactly is the purpose of inspection more widely, and is inspection in any form needed? There are lots of alternatives, but of course, politicians are going to want a simple inspection system that allows them to say 85% of schools are good when we came into power, and now it's 90%, so we can show a 5% improvement in the education system.
Yeah.
I get that, but there are countries around the world that are doing these things very differently, and safeguarding is often at the heart of that.
Absolutely, yeah. There are many very high-performing school systems that don't have anything remotely like Ofsted, and that's one of the questions in the survey that goes along with this consultation: is should schools be regulated by a national body or locally by mayors or county equivalents, or like you say, by local authorities? And so maybe slimming down is still too like does it actually need to exist? Because one of the things is like you mentioned about raising standards, like it's standard, the Ofsted standards, doesn't it, for the Office for Standards in Education. There's a bit more to it than that, but that's basically it. And yet there's no evidence that Ofsted raises standards. Like there was I don't have the data. If people are interested in that, if they look up the report, I'll put it in the show notes. All the references are in there. It might have been the National Audit Office or something that there's no evidence that Ofsted actually does what it says it's designed to do, what it says that it does in its mission statement. And so, yeah, does it actually even need to be slimmed down? And then people might say, but what about all of that other stuff? And it is important, the other stuff, that the schools are accountable not only for safeguarding, but for curriculum and behaviour and attendance and assessment practices and all of that stuff. And then we propose that alongside this sort of safeguarding audit, which, as you say, could be done by a local authority, that there is then like what we call a school accountability network, where a school is sort of partnered up with another local school, and they inspect one another, right? And so they make a little vertical slice team. So there's school leaders, middle leaders, early career teachers, the SENCO, teaching assistants, kids, parents. Then they could go into another school, and I've done work on this. There's a thing called research informed peer review. Where you go into a different school and you look at a particular issue. So that school might have a self-evaluation report that says, we're not getting feedback right currently. We really need to get our heads around this, and this is going to be our focus for this year. And you can look at other things as well, but that's mainly look at feedback. And then that's going to be a focus of like a 3-year working relationship, say, with this other school, and then we switch partners, and then they get partnered up with some other school, and so that accountability, and those schools would write reports, and there could be a template where they fill out, what they're seeing, and then that can be stored centrally, and if you like, even published, because it's not judgmental. It's just like, here are some things that this school is doing really well. Here are some areas that they might want to think about working on in the future, and there's an action plan to help them do that or whatever. You could have that level of accountability. Like it's the whole thing seems to be based on the idea that they're trying to sort of like catch these lazy, feckless teachers out, being lazy and feckless, and that they're sort of, that this is somehow necessary to stop people from getting away with it, Absolutely.
And I think it also comes from a sense of a power imbalance, that they, as Ofsted, have some sort of knowledge and special view of things that confers on them the ability to make judgments about schools, that's conferred on them, for example, the capacity to create these curriculum research reports, research reviews rather, that's conferred on them the capacity to write about child-on-child abuse in the wake of the Everyone's Invited scandal. But actually, there are lots of other voices in society that are more than capable, and probably far better placed to do that with greater independence. If the idea of those Ofsted research reviews is to bring together a web of research to make it more accessible for staff and schools, that sounds quite noble. But to do that, it would need to be far more representative of a wider range of research than those reports are.
Yeah.
If you look at the work, for example, of Mark Priestley in Scotland, he talks a lot about teachers as curriculum makers. I think it's Mark Priestley that says that. And there's an argument now that some of the thinking that's driven Ofsted's framework is pushing some multi-academy trusts into a position of removing autonomy from staff and taking away the power to be curriculum makers, and actually just creating recreating them as deliverers of a curriculum. And that deprofessionalization is a real issue within the profession, and contributes to recruitment and retention issues. So there are so many connected issues here. But I mean, the metaphor I use is, I feel like Ofsted sits at the center of our educational solar system like a dark star, and its gravitational pull is felt absolutely everywhere. It is impossible to escape it, and it freights the system with fear. And that is at the heart of why we're all speaking out, because we're saying that isn't good enough. It's certainly not good enough for our children. It absolutely isn't good enough for our staff.
Totally. And as you say, like it's at the heart of, I like that metaphor a lot. And it's the heart of this nexus of all of these issues that we're seeing, especially around recruitment and retention, as you say. Like when we started kicking around those ideas, we were sort of saying like, it was a bit of a flippant reference to Make America Great Again. So we're sort of saying like, make teaching desirable again, right?
Yeah.
Like, because it's really hard, like recruitment and retention. Why are there so few people applying to become teachers? Why are there so many leaving the profession? Because it's so hard and stressful. And you see these people now writing these blogs saying, I've left teaching and it's wonderful to come in. There's a huge Facebook group about like ex-teachers all sort of celebrating the newfound freedom and how they have a 9-to-5 job and they don't have to take all this stress and marking and stuff and report writing home with them. There are many interconnected problems, but I think that, as you say, that this fear-inducing organization is right at the heart of it. And I think that it absolutely needs to be addressed. And so go on, we're going to come in there. And
the great frustration is that Ofsted themselves don't recognise that. I think they seem to feel that they've listened to the concerns that have been raised, but I don't think they've even started listening properly. And I think there is a long road to travel to address this issue. I mean, I'm incredibly proud to do this job, and I think it's a huge privilege to do this job. It makes me so sad when I hear of staff who've left the profession and who've had really terrible experiences. If my children went into the education professions, I would be absolutely delighted. But I think part of the issue for that doesn't just sit with Ofsted, it sits with the denigration of public service. That I don't know how political I'm allowed to get on this podcast, James, but for me that really took root with the Johnson premiership and hasn't righted itself. And I don't think public service is something that's really praised and valued. I would even point to, well prior to Johnson coming into power, the rebranding of the Department for Education, Children and Families as the Department for Education. And what's been removed there is the idea of service to communities, children and families in their communities. And I think we feel that. We feel that in the impact on resources, the impact on funding. That affects recruitment as well. I think, of course, the other thing is that a lot of staff have gone through the pandemic and have seen the flexibilities that are available to people in other walks of life. And understandably, they want those things because it means you can take your child to school in the mornings. It means you can spend a bit more time with your child growing up. It means all kinds of things that are not benefits on which you can put a price, but are deeply valuable things.
Totally. Yeah, it's interesting that, isn't it? That shift, the narrowing down of the remit from the DCSF, as it was called, and it was sometimes jokingly referred to as the Department for Cushions and Soft Furnishings, right? That it was like, it was a bit of a long-winded definition, but to reduce it down to education, it's almost like you can just take education in isolation from other areas of social policy. Like you say, schools don't exist in a vacuum, and often, for example, the schools are given the responsibility of like close the disadvantage gap, essentially like fix intergenerational poverty and disadvantage and underachievement and entrenched, problems in communities in the context of 5 hours of lessons in a day. And actually, there's a bit more going on to the disadvantage gap than that.
I mean, that is a whole other podcast, isn't it? Because that opens up so many difficult assumptions around class and poverty and race and language that sit behind many of the policy pronouncements that we've seen, that sit behind elements of the inspection framework that there is effectively a certain way to be a citizen in this country. And if you're not that way, your life is much more problematic, but also you are problematized yourself. And it contributes to this sort of deficit view that takes root, and the source of which is institutions like Ofsted. And that damages hugely the way in which people see themselves, the way in which communities see themselves. An inadequate or RI judgment on a school and a community can have huge ripples across parishes, community centres, whole groupings of people.
Mm-hmm.
And that all is then reflected back onto a tiny number of people who are often dealing with, particularly in the last 3 or 4 years, a set of social circumstances that are far beyond their control. And the things that they can control are relatively small compared to the size of the problem.
Yeah, absolutely.
But they do it anyway, I think, with great nobility and a great sense of service. I've not met anyone at any level in schools who doesn't feel a massive sense of service, however they articulate it to their schools. And I think that needs to be celebrated. And my last point about Ofsted, James, if I may, and I'll try and make this the last point, is that I think they have contributed to a very negative view of young people. And I dare say they haven't meant to do it, because I suppose if you're raising standards and improving lives, what you want to do is celebrate the young people whose schools you're inspecting. But when the narrative is constantly around what young people have failed to do, the gaps that need closing, the knife crime that they're involved in, the mental health problems that they face, the issues to do with things like so-called child-on-child abuse and safeguarding and gangs, that inevitably extends into the wider social sphere of communities, and people start thinking and talking very negatively about young people. Our young people over the last 3 years have faced problems the like of which I didn't face, and on top of that, they have the challenges of social media and other things like that. And I think they've been utterly brilliant and an absolute model of genuine resilience, and they just don't get credit for it. The Scottish Parliament applauded their young people, and I'm still waiting for our Parliament to do the same thing. So.
Wow. Yeah, right. That's really interesting. Yeah, right. You're just sort of like continually saying like, you're not doing this, you're not doing this, you're not doing this. And it locates all of these problems in the child. Just before we started recording, you were talking, weren't you, about how you're often invited onto like local radio and stuff to talk about vaping. And it's like there are these hot button issues that everybody gets very hot under the collar about. Yeah. But they're often sort of like quite small issues that place the problem in the child. It's like, oh, the kids are vaping, what we're going to do about that? And there are many, many bigger fish to fry. And maybe we'll come back to some of those bigger fish towards the end of this conversation. But let's pause Ofsted for now. We will make that the last point on them for now, because like you say, like they don't deserve this amount of airtime. Like obviously it does, because it's a huge problem that needs to be fixed. But we do need to shift the conversation and it
shouldn't feel this fearsome to talk about it. But I'm slightly over that now. But at first, it felt like I was breaking the last great taboo of society talking about this publicly. And I'm struck by the number of heads who have talked about it anonymously, and I don't blame them.
Absolutely, of course, right. Well, like Stephen Ball is a brilliant sociologist of education. I don't know if you're familiar with his work. He talks about it as the micropolitics of little fears, right? Like why don't people speak out? Because they're afraid, right? Because there's football manager syndrome among head teachers. You've got kids and mouths to feed and a mortgage, and like I've got a friend who's about to leave the teaching profession, and he's currently talking about writing a book to talk about all of the things that he's not been allowed to talk publicly about while he's been a teacher. Because if he talks about what it's really like to be, for example, he talks about how it's really difficult to teach, especially bottom set kids, but like just generally kids who are struggling to pass. So he's a science teacher. You're teaching them about things like the specific heat capacity of steel versus water or whatever it might be. And it's just really abstract stuff that like they have to know about to pass the exam, but that's got zero relevance to their lives. And it's quite hard to get their heads around. And he's essentially just saying like, it feels like it's my job to make kids feel bad about themselves. That's how it feels sometimes. And that actually my job, the way that I interpret it, is that I need to shield them from that, and I need to just like give them, like make them leave my lesson feeling like they've achieved something. But that's not really, like officially what he's supposed to be doing.
Yeah.
And
I mean, that's so sad, isn't it? To hear a professional feel that way. I mean, I was talking to our assistant head who's in charge of professional development and learning and teaching recently, and she was talking about how we're going to develop our assessment strategy. And she said, we need an assessment strategy that makes kids feel 10 feet tall.
Yeah.
I thought that is an I haven't got permission to name her, so I won't, but that says everything about her as a person, but absolutely everything about what drives her as a professional as well.
Totally. And I don't think it would be hard to construct that assessment system. I think it would be a bottom-up one rather than having some standard like grade 9. Essentially, the whole system is just like everybody's in varying degrees of failing to get straight grade 9s at GCSE. And, and even the ones who get straight grade 9s, they're not necessarily that well off either, because they're like terrified of getting an 8, terrified of getting a B, terrified of failure, and working their fingers to the bone. So even for the so-called winners, this setting this very high bar is not particularly healthy. And if we had a bottom-up accountability system, an assessment system that celebrates every achievement as a pat on the back and a badge you can stick on your sleeve, it seems like it's quite straightforward. But just quickly to come back to that friend of mine, at the moment, he feels like he wouldn't be able to come on a podcast like this and speak openly about how that feels, because if his senior leaders were listening, they would say, well, you're talking the school down, you're bringing the school into disrepute. What if the parents hear, And so there are all kinds of things that people aren't saying that need to be said. And so I absolutely applaud people like yourself and others who are speaking out, and those who are speaking out anonymously, because there are things that really, really need to be said, and that we need to overcome that thing, the micro-politics of little fears, in order to shift the dial.
And these things actually go to the heart of some of the deepest issues of inequality or inequity, rather, in our country. I mean, for example, I won't name the school, but I checked the website of a very prominent private school that at least one prime minister has attended, not the obvious one, okay? So it can't be named. I couldn't find its inspection report anywhere. Now, obviously, it's not inspected by Ofsted, but I have a duty on my website to ensure that our inspection reports are published. It shouldn't be that difficult on a school that has a fees of around about £45,000 a year, all the extras, to find the inspection report. But I was also struck by the beautiful rhetoric that ran through the entire website around pastoral care and the curriculum and co-curricular, extracurricular things. And I thought, well, the English, specifically English, I think, model of private or independent schooling has been held up as a gold standard around the world. It's replicated constantly, isn't it? As schools open outposts in Shanghai and Hong Kong. And it's often held up in relation to discussions about cultural capital, but at no point has it been subjected to the kind of accountability measures and inspection regime that state schools are.
Yeah. Totally.
And it's not just a simple case of saying, well, state schools deserve it because they're funded by the state, because that it's absolutely not as simple as that. And it occurs to me in relation to that Ofsted, when we went into lockdown, did the decent thing and got out of the way, didn't they? And we didn't see them for months. And absolutely nobody missed them. And nothing bad happened in schools because Ofsted weren't there. Yeah. And even Ofsted themselves would need to admit that. I don't know if they have admitted that publicly. But they then had the temerity when we as schools made PPE for local hospitals because the government hadn't procured it, when we delivered sandwiches. Our school, for example, dug into its own budget to pay for free school meals for weeks and weeks and weeks until the free school meals debacle was solved in England by dear old Gavin Williamson. We did all those things. And at the end of that, Amanda Spielman had the temerity to say that schools had spent too much time looking after vulnerable pupils and delivering sandwiches and not enough time focusing, I think it was on reading or something like that, when there was precisely no plan for schools in all this. And that to me speaks volumes about the dissonance between the reality of schools and the ideology of inspection.
Yeah.
That was the last word on Ofsted to me.
Yeah, they snuck back into the conversation.
They keep coming, don't they? Yeah.
They keep coming. Yeah. Right, so let's shift the dial.
Let's rethink education.
So, as you know, as somebody who's listened to previous episodes of the podcast, I very much like to get to know the guest, right? And to understand a little bit about you and your own experience of education, and also the significant learning piece about the moments that really shaped your thinking or your life along the way. Yeah. So where did you go to school?
I was born in South London, and I went to school I went to a prep school, actually, not for very long, called Donhead in Wimbledon. And I absolutely loved it. And it's a source of great amusement in my family that one of the reasons I loved it is because you could have unlimited second helpings and third helpings at lunchtime. And it was a fairly traditional Jesuit prep school, although I'm not sure any Jesuit school is actually traditional, given the Jesuits as the sort of, I don't know, the SAS of the Catholic Church. And I remember it as a very, very happy time. I remember Miss Bennett, who was a primary, whatever it was, 3 class, because I went to that school at age 7. But I also remember Wing Commander Tyrrell, who taught us history and geography, who was an absolutely terrifying man and once gave me 800 lines for turning around in class. 800 lines.
800? Yeah,
and it was a proper shorts all year round, blazer and cap school.
I must not turn around 800 times.
Well, I think Miss Bennett was fine with me turning around, but Wing Commander Tyrrell had other ideas. And I was thinking this recently, he must have been, so that was 1979, 1980, I think. So I'm trying to think what war he was a veteran of, because if he was a veteran of the Second World War, he was absolutely ancient by that point. Anyway, he terrorized us. But we had a great time. I was warned because I was taken out of a primary school to go there. I was warned by my friends from the primary school that I'd be beaten to within an inch of my life by the head teacher. But the head teacher I remember is a very gentle priest called Father Wetz, who took us for a maths class on a Thursday afternoon, I think. And I remember being taught my 13 and 14 times table by Father Wetz. And then my family moved up north to Greater Manchester, and I went to another prep school and then the local grammar school, which confusingly was an independent school. And of course, at the time, to me, it was just a school. Now I work in education, I realized just how mad all that identity around the type of school it was. And at the time I went there, it became officially an independent school, and there was a great palaver made about it joining the headmasters' conference, as it was known back then, which meant next to nothing to us. It went by the motto "striving for excellence," and I remember one of our teachers satirizing that as striving for mediocrity, which we all thought as boys. It was an all-boys school. We all thought that was hilarious. It was very, very strongly a rugby school, and there were many aspects about that school that I found quite troubling and made me quite unhappy, actually. But there were some fabulous teachers in the English department. A wonderful teacher who wasn't a drama teacher, but who did all the plays and shows, and I got really involved in that and the choir. And I think that probably had the greatest influence on me becoming a drama teacher. And then and then I took a year out. God, I sound like a bloody stereotype saying all this. I really do. This is embarrassing. I didn't know you were going to ask me this. And then I took a year out, and I worked for an advertising agency at first. And I thought that was the coolest thing in the world. And they let me do some quite cool stuff. But the first thing they did, and I think they paid me 50 quid for this, is they made me paint their storeroom. They gave me black paint and white paint, and I had to paint the storeroom. And I think that was a test of character, I suppose, because then thereafter they let me stay. And I sort of pretended to be an account manager at the age of 18, but I didn't really know what that meant. And just watched what to me felt like being in Mad Men, but it wasn't. No one smoked that much. And there wasn't.
Right. But I imagine quite a creative
either.
Quite a creative place to work, though.
Yeah. And actually, I think the building, it was run by a lovely guy, actually, a really, really fine man. And the building was the Royal Exchange building in Manchester. And we were on, I think, the 4th or the 5th floor.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that's now where some Ofsted offices are. So there you go. There's a bit of synchronicity there.
How funny. I used to work in the Royal Exchange.
Did you?
In the cafe.
In the theatre?
Yeah, in the cafe, there was a part of the theatre. Yeah.
So then I went overseas to Johannesburg and worked in Johannesburg. God, this was an eye opener. I lived in Johannesburg and worked on the streets for several months with street children. Johannesburg is famous for all the wrong reasons in this respect, for having, I think at the time, this was 1991, about 6,000 or 7,000 street children aged 3 to 18, who many of whom had come from the countryside in South Africa and had been sent there by their parents for a better life, or had been disowned, or had been victims of sexual abuse or trafficking. And they lived on the streets, and I taught them in my own ineffectual way and worked with them. I've spent a while living in the shelter with them, which was, God, that was fascinating.
Wow.
That was an extraordinary experience.
Was this like a VSO thing?
Well, I'd love to say it was as organized as that, but it was done through a friend of my family's who was involved in sort of missionary work. And we bought this ticket. It was so scatty. It's mad looking back on it. We bought the airline ticket on KLM, and then I went to the airport, got on the plane, landed in Johannesburg, got picked up from the airport. And compared to nowadays, I didn't speak to my parents for about a week. And you think about that nowadays, where everyone's got mobile phones. They didn't know where I was, who I was with, what I was doing. And then eventually I got picked up by a friend of my parents and taken to their house. I've never been so pleased to see a bowl of fresh fruit. It was incredible.
Wow.
I've been living in the shelter in an abandoned church on the outskirts of Johannesburg with all these street kids. And then I worked with them for
goodness.
a few months.
And did you go out by yourself? Were you with anyone?
No, I went out completely by myself. I didn't know anybody.
At age, 20 or something?
18.
18. Oh, my goodness.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Really, I loved it. It was a fabulous experience. And this is totally unrelated to education, but here's a weird thing. My parents gave me a wedding present to take out to some people over there that we knew. And the wedding present was a fish slice, right? And I just put it in my hand luggage to take on the plane. And it went through Heathrow, no problem at all. And it wasn't until I got to Johannesburg, Jan Smuts Airport, as it was known. I doubt it's called Jan Smuts. I hope it's not called Jan Smuts Airport now. And of course, the security guard there were like, what the hell are you doing? This is like a weapon in your luggage. And you can compare that to now. And the idea of even carrying, I don't know, a pencil sharpener in your luggage would get you jumped on by security. And I'd waltz through Heathrow with this thing. Anyway, I've got lots of yeah. So then
amazing. And do you remember what these kids made of you? This 18-year-old English guy who turned up to teach them stuff.
Yeah. Well, they just thought they thought this guy is from another planet. I remember they were very, very, very welcoming and generous and fascinated by me. And fascinated by the clothes I was wearing, which, by the way, folks, were not trendy even for 1991, and fascinated by the things I had with me. Several boys would keep pressing my skin to see, because when you press your skin, you get a white mark. Remember them doing that. And they were fascinated by the fact that I didn't have the same diet as them, and that they wanted to know what football team I supported. They were obsessed with Manchester United, obsessed with Liverpool. They had millions of questions, and they were quite fascinated by everything about life outside their sphere. And of course, I probably got this totally wrong, and I probably thought I was some kind of savior. But looking back on it, it's so hard to navigate to walk the line between being just totally wide-eyed and fascinated by a new culture and being respectful and humble in the presence of the people who actually live there, and thinking your job isn't, you could learn a million things more from these people than they're ever going to learn from you. And there were inevitably some really sad stories and some very shocking things, and the sort of as full an exposure, I suppose, as someone in my position could have had to the realities of living in a highly racist and racialized country. But I don't think I fully took on board those lessons until years later. I don't think I processed them or understood them. I think I was just, wow, this is nuts, but I'm just going to go with it.
So I'm just trying to think of the timeline. 91. So that was post Mandela's release.
It was post-Mandela's release, and it was a period of time when there was huge unrest.
Yeah, I read a really good book recently called Knowing Mandela, where people talk about what a brilliant, like, sort of peaceful transition of power it was. But it was not peaceful out in the townships. There was lots and lots of violence unfolding.
I remember it as being very bloody and there being a lot of violence, but not being directly exposed to it, except on a handful of occasions. And then it was really terrifying. But also getting really, really told off for staying out late. Really told off for staying out late, because where I would go and hang out wasn't where people like me were expected to be hanging out. I also remember naively, I don't know if you know Johannesburg particularly well, but they had, I don't know if they still have this, they had what they call black taxis, which were like people carriers. And they were really only for black people to travel from townships into work and to and from work in the city. And I, on a few occasions, just got on them because it was the easiest thing to get rather than getting the public service bus. And I remember on several occasions being told, with the best of intentions by someone on that taxi, you need to get off this, son. You shouldn't be on here because you're putting yourself at risk. Taking kids to hospital, and hospitals, and the area of the hospital for black people was just a mass of people in dire straits, facing long waits with pretty horrendous things that had happened to them. But I also remember learning a great deal about, I remember trying to remember to learn a great deal about serving other people and all that. And I'm very careful about what I would say about it, because I was the naive white boy from a very wealthy background compared to them. And if I was doing it now, I'd do it very differently, but I would still do it.
Interesting. And I suppose that you could think, there's a wider conversation there, isn't there, about the nature of missionary work more generally.
And it wasn't really missionary work, but that's how I had access to it.
Yeah.
And those kids as a teacher, ran rings around me. I mean, I was doing all right.
Talk about a baptism of fire at age 18. Yeah. That's something else. Well, that definitely counts as our first episode of significant learning. So is there anything else that springs to mind as you look back over your life since then, about key ideas that have shaped you, maybe key figures? It could be a book that you read. What are the things that have really shaped you into the leader that you are today?
Quite a few things, really. I mean, from my own education, definitely a number of my own teachers, particularly in regard to English and history to an extent as well. But then when I started work, and this is really something I've only kind of processed now, the people I worked with for the best part of 20 years in Scotland, when I joined the profession, it was at a time of local authority reorganisation. And I think there was a sense in which Scottish education over time was going to have to change. But I met an awful lot of very inspiring people who were totally dedicated to the community that they lived in and absolutely committed to ensuring that young people were really well looked after. I can think people who stand out for me, and it's almost pernicious to name them, but John Donaher, who was the first assistant head teacher I ever worked for, and John, a big guy from Ayrshire, from a little village in Ayrshire called Saun. Ever get the chance to go to Ayrshire, go to Saun. Beautiful place, right? And it's the same area as Bill Shankly comes from, right? And John was pretty old school. In the old days, he had worn a gown round school, but this was St. Joseph's Academy, Kilmarnock. It's what people would have unfairly labelled a bog standard comprehensive school. No school should be labelled that, but that's how some people would have seen it. It was unremarkable, and in that there were lots of schools like it. But it was a really, really special school, and people really were dedicated to it. And John would do his work in a tracksuit every day, and then change into a tie every now and again. And John taught me the value of connections and relationships with pupils and their families. He'd tell every class he taught they were his favourite class, and he really meant it. And he was such a kind, decent person who just absolutely lived out that ethic of public service. So he would be one. All the head teachers I worked for, Alan Ward, Bridget Rooney, who absolutely supported all the work I did in drama. We set up a theatre company. We went on tour. We got into the papers for all the right reasons, with reviews of shows, the national papers in Scotland. We performed at big theatres. That was amazing. I loved all that. And in that respect, the biggest inspiration there was the pupils and their families. And I'm still really good friends with lots of those pupils who are now in their 30s and their families. And we go to weddings and christenings and funerals. And those things left a huge mark on me. And then latterly, I ended up as head of that school. And that process coincided, I think, with the first, well, two things really that stand out. One is curriculum for excellence, which I look back on now as a huge wasted opportunity in Scotland to do something genuinely progressive, but I don't think what that ended up with was progressive. And then also that first phase of schools starting to get to grips with young people's well-being and mental health as an absolute priority. And that was because of very specific experiences that we had and the people I worked with there. And there's just too many to name. But yeah, I've been very lucky in my career.
Really interesting. Thank you. Just on that, like, I know this is probably a big conversation, but would you mind to just give me like a précis version of that, what you just said about the curriculum for excellence in Scotland and how you think that it was a missed opportunity? So I've been doing a lot of work in Wales recently with the curriculum for Wales, and it's really, really interesting, huge efforts to rethink how they're going about what happens in schools, and with obvious sort of possibilities for things to go wrong as well as right. And so I'm very interested to learn more about, because I don't know a huge amount about the Scottish experience. What would be the short version of what you just said?
Well, the first thing to say is, of course, that the architect of the Welsh reforms is Graham Donaldson, who was originally very influential in Scotland. He was chief HMI in Scotland. And I think that, I suppose, the shorthand version, and I'm sure there's critics that will tell me I'm being rose-tinted here, was that come the early 2000s, I think Scottish education had reached a point where people felt that this world-class reputation that it had was built on the backs of a relatively small proportion of the population, or rather, there was a significant minority of the population that wasn't being well served by that education. And there's no doubt that there were many great things about the Scottish education system. The idea of the laird of pets, for example, the idea of the absolute democracy.
The idea of the what did you say just then?
There's something called the laird of pets, the idea of a man, and this is an old idea, so a man, but a person who is of their community and has a wide range of education that allows them to access knowledge from all sorts of spheres. A sort of, I suppose you might package it as a Renaissance person.
Okay, like a polymath or something.
Yeah, polymath. And I think that's an accurate definition of it. I stand corrected if it's not. But and the Scottish education needed to change to become more inclusive, to embrace different types of learning and different aspirations that different people had, and to meet the needs of a very changing society in all sorts of aspects of its demographic. And also, and that's where phrases like 21st century skills came from, I think, which is actually much derided, unfairly, I think. And that also coincided with the huge platform that people like Sir Ken Robinson had. And I speak as someone who is an unabashed fan of Sir Ken Robinson. And that's not to say I would brook no criticism of him, but I think his influence is being sorely misrepresented sometimes recently.
Yeah.
And all of that contributed to a change in education that was often driven by people who were in the arts, who were in creative industries, who wanted to make education a much more expansive and enlivening process. And I think we took a lot of steps towards that. And I was very privileged to be part of early groups that looked at drama and art and music education and contributed to the development of the curriculum in that respect. And it introduced the concept of interdisciplinary learning, of defining a school not just by its exam results, but by the link between its academic education and its ethos. Personal development and well-being was at the part of that. It mirrored some of the things that were happening in England under New Labour. But I think where it fell apart is that we never addressed properly the issue of formal public exams and assessment. And consequently, it was always driven back to a less than progressive view of how we judge and measure the progress of young people throughout an education system. And lots of people, myself included, tried to experiment with things, some of which worked, some of which didn't. And I worry now that people conflate that with what some will see as a decline in pupils' behavior, for example, in schools, because they'll say, basically, kids were given too much freedom, staff didn't have enough guidance. And I think staff didn't have enough guidance. I think that's absolutely true. I think it was extremely patchy and very dependent on individual schools and local authorities. And in the end, really a huge missed opportunity is the narrative I would put around it. And you can see it in the decline of modern languages, for example, in Scottish schools. You can see it in the decline of some other subjects. You can see it in a loss of confidence that people had in the education system, and in the way that people have been able to take pot shots at Scottish education because of things like PISA rankings, none of which I think is fair, because Scotland has maintained where England has not done this, a highly trained workforce where the gatekeeping around the profession in teaching is extremely tight. England jettisoned the General Teaching Council that it copied from Scotland, but Scotland has maintained that. And I think a combination of Scottish education unions, and I've got relatives who are high up in Scottish education unions, just for full disclosure, and the GTC and Education Scotland and the government have all had a much more productive working relationship than the much more combative one that's exists down in England. When I came in, I could not believe how supine the unions were. They've only just found their voice, I think. And I was dismayed at the way in which there didn't seem to be constructive and creative conflict around discussions to do with the curriculum. So that's a potted version of it. It's
fascinating.
The curriculum for excellence it's a highly charged issue and very contested, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I realized that I asked you to do something really difficult there, which is to summarize this highly contested thing, complex, huge thing. But thank you. That was really insightful, especially the stuff around the way that Scotland has maintained the integrity of the workforce, not least, the way that they pay their teachers. Like when there's recently some tables doing the rounds where they were comparing, how teachers in England are paid compared to Scotland, and the difference is really vast. Like sort of like for a middle leader, it's like the difference between sort of like 30, 35 and 43,000 pounds a year or something. You're like, how can anybody in those northern towns in like Carlisle and like close to the border, how can any schools on the English side of the border recruit when somebody's within commuting distance of like an $8,000 pay hike for the same role,
Yeah. That's an interesting way of putting it. And I'm not sure it was always the case. I think the disparity may have worked at one stage in the 90s and early 2000s, may have worked the other way. And I would be honest as well and say that one of the frustrations as a head teacher in Scotland was that because all schools are local authority schools that are in the state system, with the exception of a handful that slightly sit outside it, they're grant maintained, I had less control over my budget than I do in a school in England. And consequently, it was very hard to appoint staff who were not teachers if we wanted to create roles that were support roles that we thought were quite creative and that were needed and that responded to circumstances. And I know that was a frustration that often many of my fellow heads in Scotland said. And when it was clear that I was moving to leave to go to England, that several people said, "Oh, well, you'll like that freedom a lot more." And I do think that one of the problems Scotland had is it didn't resolve the conflict between the very central allocation of resources to local authorities and the need for them to be managed and that management to be devolved to schools in their entirety. And if I don't know what the percentage of the budget that I managed in Scotland was, but I managed 100% of the budget in England. In Scotland, it would have been a fraction of that because so much of it was devolved to the centre. The flip side of that is that the more intelligent and I think more constructive working between unions and local authorities in Scotland means that there is much more protection, quite rightly, for staff who work in schools in Scotland. And it feels to me like, and this is just it feels to me like that's not always the case in England, because it's possible to rip up the Burgundy Book and for different terms and conditions to apply.
Sorry, the Burgundy book.
The Burgundy book being the terms and conditions that govern teachers working in state schools.
Right, got you. Okay, thank you.
And this is my understanding. I'm not part of a MAT, that MATs don't need to adhere to that. And I can see that there might be some advantages to that, but I suppose the issue is whether or not we feel that that's good in the long run for the equity and status of the teaching profession.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, got it. Okay. All right, thank you. So we're going to wrap this up in the next few minutes, right. And I have 3 more questions for you, and it's the 3 questions that I ask to every guest: positives, challenges, solutions, and you can have one of each.
Okay.
Right. And so let's start with the positives. Something that you like the look of, something that we're getting right currently, something that you would like to boost the signal of or shout from the rooftops about.
Okay. I see a huge number of school leaders and schools working incredibly hard to include all young people in their setting. And I think we need to shout about that and talk about that more. We need to resource it better, and people need to be praised for doing that, not run the risk of an unfavorable judgment.
Interesting. Yeah, thank you. I know that you we were having a conversation off air earlier about attendance, and attendance is obviously a huge issue, and that links to what you were just talking about, isn't it? Doesn't it, about inclusion and just
and I suppose
make sure that people feel welcomed and a part of school life.
Yeah, that's it. And I suppose this isn't a second positive I'm sneaking in, that inclusion's is only possible because of the dedication of the staff. And I think I'm in awe of that. So it's that thing, the way staff make inclusion happen.
Totally. Love it. Okay. Thank you. The next one is, what is the major challenge that we face? And it's not allowed to be Ofsted, even if you think that, that is.
No, well, it isn't Ofsted. I think the major challenge we face is making sure that schooling is worth turning up for staff and for pupils. And what I mean by that, and I'm choosing the word worth really carefully here, is first of all that it's resourced properly and fairly, and that it's given its worth in society, and that staff are recognised for what they do. And I'm choosing the word staff carefully because there's a real danger of just talking about teachers.
Yeah.
The school I work in wouldn't work if we took everyone out of it who's not a teacher. And we say in our school that every adult is a teacher because you've got something to impart to young people. So making schools worth turning up for adults, making them great places to work, and making sure that the same applies to young people and families, that they're places that young people want to go to, with the obvious caveat that all teenagers at some point will go, oh God, do I have to go to school? That's normal. I'd be disappointed if young people didn't say that. But taking that out of it, you want them to think, this has really got something to offer me, and I'm excited about the possibilities of at least some part of it, and I feel like I'm included. I feel like my voice is heard, and it's going to help me do something great with my life. And I don't think we've got that. I mean, I think all of us want that, and I think even the people I disagree with want that. We just need to find common ground.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so that brings us to the last question then, which is, how are we going to do that? And I realize how hard that question is. How are we going to create a system that is worth turning up for? Right.
Well, I think that someone has got to have the courage to stop the bus and to say, right, enough. Right. We don't need any more reform. We don't need any more change until we've had a conversation about this and we've properly considered the possibilities. We've properly considered the impacts, and we've drawn up I don't know, for the sake of argument, people will talk about a 10, a 15, a 20-year plan for education that we are actually going to stick to. And that, in as far as this is possible, in what's a fairly febrile environment, has some kind of cross-party consensus and support to it. And that will mean, I'm afraid, jettisoning some of the balmy voices on all sides and focusing on a very, very broad common ground. And I think there is a huge area of common ground between an awful lot of people. It's really easy to be distracted by Twitter. But as someone said on Twitter the other day, there's 5% who bang on about something, and the other 5% who come against them, and in the middle is 90% who are saying, we'll have a bit of both, thanks very much, because we are doing what we think works for the young people in front of us at this time. And I think that's where very, very unhelpful conflicts are set up, and this doesn't need to be dialectical. This needs to be about finding more than just a conflict that gives us a common ground. It needs to be about navigating a common ground in the first place and going at it in that respect, if you see what I mean, rather than accepting we need a big bang first of all. And I think that will have the impact of taking education away from the political football arena. And there are examples of this internationally. Singapore, and I can speak from experience of seeing this, is an example of that, but it did it over a 50-year period. And by the way, I'm not saying we should replicate the Singaporean education system. I'm absolutely not. But I remember speaking to people in Singapore who talked about their 50-year plan after the Second World War and recognized that this was rooted in their sense of national identity, the way in which they relate to other countries, their economy, a whole load of things. So unless we're prepared to have that conversation, it's actually going to be quite hard to move this on, I think, but it is possible. And what's absolutely certain is that there will need to be a continuum of change. I'm not saying there should be no change. It just needs to be considered change rather than an ever-turning wheel of thoughtless, ideologically led change.
That was perfectly put. Thank you so much, Ben. I really always enjoy speaking with you. I feel like we could have spoken for much longer, and I have a huge amount that I can learn from you. I look forward to having many more such conversations in the years ahead. But for now, thank you very much for giving so generously of your time this evening. I really enjoyed it. There's such a lot in here that I'm going to go away and mull over some more. Thank you very much. Is there anything that you would like to leave our listeners and or viewers with any final words? Is there anything that you would point them in the direction of?
I think I'd point them in the direction of your local school. Go and celebrate it. And if you're thinking of going into education as a profession, give it serious thought, talk to people who love it, and ride on their coattails rather than being driven by some of the negativity you might hear around it. And for God's sake, celebrate the young people of this country because they really deserve it. And thank you, James, for having me on tonight. That's some lovely things you said there. And humbly, I thank you. And I always try to learn a lot from everyone I encounter. I've learned a lot from you as well. So thank you.
We have a narrow curriculum which squeezes out the arts. So let's rethink education. There is a lack of imagination and not enough fun. So let's rethink education. Children should be self-directed, showing us their way. Let them lead. Transferable skills should be the core of what we teach. Learn for life. So let's try. Right and not what is required. Let's have fun, let's explore. Let's bring back the love, forget the fear of being fired. We're forced to rank the children as Ofsted ranks the schools. So let's rethink education. We have a lack of agency. We're trapped inside the system. So let's rethink education. A place of transformation that embraces